Thank you, because it's extraordinary that technology allows us to do this. What we're witnessing in our lives is the end of exile, some of these old bad tools of political repression. And there's no better time, I think, to talk about this than now, when the moment is difficult. I mean, think about it, what we see all around at every moment. What a time to be alive. By nearly any metric, we've never been safer, freer, or more comfortable. And yet, it always feels like we're moments from the brink of catastrophe. All of us can feel it, feels something in the air around us in politics. There's this new atmosphere of fear that's rolling in over the world in these last few decades. Today, even in the safest places, by the end of the evening, the very worst thing from the farthest corner of the world in the morning is made to light the glass in every home, everywhere. It joins us, it penetrates our most personal spaces. We are exposed to terrifying stories all of the time. Eager to exploit the trauma of this endless parade of commercialized violence, once marginalized forces of exclusion and fascism are creeping ever more aggressively into the light of day. In any given week, it's no longer hard to witness the total surrender of political courage in the face of this fear, with each new campaign becoming more shrill, more alarmist than the last. Something must be done, they say, in the face of threats that honestly claim fewer Western lives than bathroom falls, and in some cases, our own police. Cherished rights and ancient values are being sacrificed to make the way for the rise of new walls. The boundaries of an open society, drawn in our heirlooms, this treasured ink that was won by the sacrifice of generations, are increasingly now illustrated instead more by razor wire, barbed wire, than writers. The stateless and the dissidents who once gave rise to nations like the United States now find upon arrival black barriers more often than golden doors. Here we are, suddenly. We're living in a world of checkpoints, and not just for refugees. Your association and movements are investigated and recorded more perfectly by sitting in this room with a phone in your pocket than any search of your actual home could possibly achieve. I sat at that desk. I used those tools. I typed in the names. Your loves and hopes are instantly crystallized and shelved. They're archived the instant they blossom, with nothing more than a vague promise from the authorities that these things won't be looked at, except in compliance with even more vague regulations. Now, this is not something that simply doesn't matter. It's not something we can wave away. We can't say, oh, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, because privacy isn't about something to hide. Privacy is about something to protect. It's about the right to the self, the right to a free mind. It's the ability to be different without being judged, so long as you're not causing anyone harm. It's the ability to drive society forward by trying something new. Perhaps there are laws that say they can monitor us. Perhaps there are laws that say it doesn't matter whether or not you're doing anything wrong, your records should still be collected. Everyone should create a perfect record of your private life, whether they're a government, whether they're a corporation, simply because they can, because it's cheap, because it's free, because perhaps under some argument it's legal. But we need to remember that the legality of a thing is very different from the morality of it. The law, for all its merits, cannot tell us the difference between right and wrong. The law, for all of its value, is ultimately ink on a page. If law is to be a force for justice, Its strength must be derived from the public and its will. More simply, the law doesn't defend us. We defend the law. And when it works against us, it is incumbent upon us to tear it down and institute something new, something better, something that is more in line with our values. We did not fight revolutions in all of our countries throughout history for access to secret policy or regulations. We fought to establish universal rights. Those rights are threatened today, not by the sporadic violence of these ignorant madmen. Such terrorists have existed throughout our histories, and they have always been defeated. Terrorists don't hate us for our freedoms. They don't even know what our freedoms are. Elevating criminals like this is the laziest kind of rhetoric. Terrorists, for all of their evil, are incapable of destroying our rights or diminishing our societies. They lack the strength. Only we can do that through unthinking, reflexive fear. Rights are lost by cowardly laws that are passed in moments of panic. Rights are lost to the cringing complicity of leaders who fear the loss of their office more than the loss of our liberty. Ask yourself, would your leaders sacrifice your rights for one more term in office? What about the rights of the other? Those who may not look like us, those who may not think like us. What about the rights of the foreign, of the refugee from war? These things may sound provocative. They might make a few in the room uncomfortable, particularly if they happen to be a politician. Some questions are dangerous. But a society cannot remain free without them. How we arrived in this world of mass surveillance is now known, thanks to journalists. The public was never asked, and we simply weren't permitted to know. Even legislators were denied an understanding of what it is exactly that their votes were meant to authorize in these vague bills. The father of America's mass surveillance system later said, after passing the Patriot Act, his bill was never meant to permit exactly those abuses that it was later used to carry out. It's through this abuse of the state secrets regime and espionage trials that the government constructed a monopoly on access to even basic facts about its operations. The idea here is that, nobody says we need to know the names of every terrorist. We don't need to know everyone who's under investigation. We don't need to know the names of every program, every capability. But we must have access to an understanding of the broad powers and policies that the government uses both in our name and against us. It's understandable if you're the government why they would want to prevent this. The people cannot protest what they do not know. It is a strategy that has only one counter: investigative journalism. This is, unfortunately, regrettably, precisely the reason that governments of the Five Eyes Surveillance Alliance, that's the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, describe journalists in now public top secret documents as a national security threat, right between terrorists and hackers. That's where you find journalists. We need to ask ourselves, what would happen if the government actually succeeded in countering this threat of investigative journalism? If we only knew what governments wanted us to know, we wouldn't know very much at all. But really, when we think about this, the idea is, if governments are able to counter the threat of journalism, what does it mean? We become dependent, not independent. Our votes mean less. Our influence becomes less. We are no longer partners to government, we are subject to government. And it's for this reason that we must resist by any means efforts to abridge the freedom of the press. If you think about democracy like a garden, journalism is the tree whose fruit, its stories, feed the public. Sources, often described today as whistleblowers, they are the roots that give the tree life. When the roots and the tree are left to grow in accord with the nature, the public thrives upon this bounty that it produces. But when powerful institutions, be they corporate, be they governmental, or anything else, can work without interference to cut the roots and reshape that tree, it produces a poison that then twists society in accordance with these manipulations. It twists society to match the suffering of that garden. We often hear journalism and whistleblowing talked about, but these are not two issues. They are one and the same. When we see surveillance authorities that have been justified on the basis of national security being used increasingly in places one would not expect, such as Canada and Australia, and they're using these capabilities intentionally to starve the public of vital but embarrassing stories. By this, I mean they're using the tools of mass surveillance, not to find terrorists, but to find the sources of journalists, journalists who have written stories that were embarrassing to the government. This creates a wound upon democracy from which we bleed that weakens all of us. It reduces the faith in our institutions. It reduces the understanding of our public. It reduces our independence and our ability to assert an equal relationship and guide the future of our societies. And this is not something that we see just happening on the fringes. In the United States, we've seen similar things to a lesser extent, but it's unfortunately accelerating in a very concerning way. The new president describes the free press as and these are his words, the enemy of the people. He spends an increasing proportion of his time denouncing what is true as fake, and informative leaks as a grave threat to national security. But let there be no mistaking the true intention behind any crackdown on leaks, on talking to the press from a man who routinely gossips about the most highly classified information in the most reckless manner. Prosecuting the sources of journalism cannot produce a safe society. And this is not something that we see just happening on the fringes. In the United States, we've seen similar things to a lesser extent, but it's unfortunate. Sorry, we had a little bit of an echo problem there. Let me see if we can get back on track. A quiet society is not a democratic one. Democratic societies are unpredictable. They are at times riotous. They're at times heretical. They question orthodoxies. They question relationships because they are free. They are constantly evaluating their state of being, evaluating if it meets their needs, if this is the kind of world that they want to have for themselves and to pass for their children. Now, autocrats know all too well that openly sort of entering into this garden of our democracy to cut down that tree in the perfect light of day is a recipe for protest. And it is for exactly this reason that they instead come in the night to cut at those roots, to carve at the sources behind the stories. This is the end of legitimacy for any state when they begin down this road. A government willing to trade public awareness for political comfort may rule, but they do not lead. The cost of autocracy is in legitimacy. And though none of us have wished for this, it is increasingly near. I say we stand now at the crossroads of history. And each of our actions are casting votes as to which direction we will proceed. All of us can see the path that has been laid out for us, that is paved with fear. Therein lies a world of walls, literal and figurative. The policing and surveillance of our speech, whether we are criminals or innocents. The denunciation of inconvenient journalism as fake news. And the prosecution of those who are speaking facts. This is the world of our garden abandoned. But this path of fear is not inevitable. At each moment, when we wake up, when we progress through the day, we have a chance together to turn away from fear. In a world where we are constantly terrorized by our reaction to the world, we are not rational, we are not thinking, we are not leading, we are led. We are not in charge, we are subordinate. Something does have to be done, ladies and gentlemen, and that thing is to be brave. We can banish fear from our politics. We can drive it from our homes. We can tear away the wires separating our countries, our societies, and increasingly crossing our internet. And this need not be rhetoric, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say. This is something you can take to the bank from a man who is overcoming exile right now by transforming, even for a moment, into a machine. We have new technologies, new capabilities to enforce human rights through new means. Within our lifetimes, for every silenced voice, we can make 1,000 more rise. Please let the next one be yours.